Let me proceed, and I think what I need to begin with is to highlight that this project builds on earlier research going back to 2013. So it's at about that time that there started to be a lot of interest in this whole notion of risk culture. What is it exactly, and how can we go about assessing it? So I was involved in a project looking at the risk culture in large banks that began in 2013. And our initial goal was to develop a survey instrument, a validated scale that could be used for assessing culture in financial institutions. So we achieved that goal. That research is now published. And what we did there was to identify 4 dimensions or factors of risk culture, as you see highlighted there on the slide. So this is a measure of risk culture that is based on employee perceptions. Now I'd imagine, if you're like other audiences that I've addressed, there are many people that are somewhat sceptical about the use of employee surveys, and I certainly agree that there are a lot of problems you can get into with employee surveys. Unfortunately, I do see a number of poor practices across the industry. But if they're conducted well, I do believe that they can be very informative. In this particular study, you'll see that of the four components that we identified, it was this one that has proven to be the most interesting. This concept of avoidance. And what we're talking about there is a staff perception that risk issues and problems are excused, downplayed, tolerated, particularly if top stars and top performers are involved. So I'd say that that was the area, when we did our research in the banks a few years ago, that was the area that gave us the greatest concern. We saw the lowest ratings in that area. We also observed, because this was a cross-country study, we did assessments of 3 of the major Australian banks and 4 of the major Canadian banks, and we discovered a relative weakness here in Australia. So the Canadian banks had more favourable risk culture, and of course subsequent events have I guess, shown that that was probably a correct reading. That culture assessment was telling us something real about problems in the banks at the time. This particular scale has now been used in the super study, and the first thing that we had to do before we could really take this further, we had to confirm statistically that this scale was valid for superannuation. And yes, that validation process worked out fine. I'm happy to take questions about that if you want to explore that issue. So I guess one of the key things to come out of that bank study was the idea that if you want to get good behavioural outcomes, if you want staff to comply with your risk policies and beyond mere compliance, you want them to be accountable, speak up, all those behaviours that we associate with good risk management, then to achieve that, what you need is a combination of favourable structures and favourable risk culture. So let me just highlight from our bank study, there was another area of concern as well as that avoidance issue that we highlighted. We discovered a problem here. Okay. In the area, I'm sure no one's going to be very surprised, in the area of remuneration. You might be wondering, well, why would you measure this using employee perceptions? Well, the problem is that on paper, a lot of remuneration policies look tremendous. It looks like that should work really well, but of course we know that a lot of the problems occur in the implementation. Policies in practice can turn out a little differently. And so I think there is a real benefit in getting, in assessing the perceptions of staff to find out what they think of those remuneration policies. And indeed, we discovered that there was this perception of bank staff 3 years ago very much was that the remuneration policies were promoting a short-term focus and in some cases encouraging people to cross the line of acceptable behaviour. So that was, so that's the story so far, if you will. So coming to the current study, what have we done exactly? Well, we have done a lot of analysis of documents. We are doing survey assessments of staff in 5 large super funds. To date, we've done 4 of those, so there's 1 still to go. We had hoped that we might be able to have more than that. I think we're defining large super funds as funds with more than 10 billion under management. So I think there would be at least 20 prospects in that pool. Unfortunately, we were only able to attract 5. Of course, that raises the question, are the 5 we've got representative of that whole pool of 20? So in order to address that potential concern, what we've done is to do a set of expert interviews. So we did interviews with 24 trustee directors, senior risk professionals, consultants and so forth. And that has helped us to form a view as to what is going on more broadly amongst large super funds. Once again, can I mention the role of the advisory panel, ASIC, Financial Services Council, Mercer Australia and RSA Archer, and that group helped us in designing the research questions and helping with introductions to organisations to participate in the study. Also providing some of the subject matter experts for the interview process. So I guess for me it was very important to come up to speed with the special issues of the superannuation sector. Of course, it is in many ways different from banks and it has taken me some time to kind of fully appreciate the extent of those differences. But what we can say is it's certainly superannuation is a complex area, managing really just a wide range of risks. And because superannuation is managing risk from a fiduciary perspective, okay, so there is that they're not managing their own money, they're managing on behalf of their members. That fiduciary relationship, I think, creates even a greater need to have effective risk management frameworks in place. Okay? You have to take even greater care than you would if you were managing your own money. So it's important to say good risk management is not about eliminating risk. I hope, I sometimes encounter that viewpoint. When I'm talking about risk management, I'm definitely not saying you've got to get rid of risk. In the superannuation context, there are many risks that you must take, okay? Investment risk being the obvious one. Okay, so if you want to, the goal of the super fund is to create quality member outcomes, and that can only be achieved by taking significant risks, but hopefully doing it very well to ensure that quality member outcomes are achieved. So yeah, it's a complex area, and there's constant regulatory change. It's an environment where members, unfortunately, are rather disengaged, and there are pressures to keep costs down. There's lots of mergers going on, or discussion about mergers. All kinds of decisions, strategic decisions, operational matters that can potentially affect the quality of member outcomes. So I guess if super funds did a bad job, okay, if their risk management was not as good as it could be, then the implication is that member outcomes would suffer. Okay? So what you would see is excessive costs, or the long run performance would be diminished in some way. So it's an important topic to address, I believe. In this study, what we've sought to do, a little bit different from the earlier bank study, is to focus more on this concept of risk management maturity. We've adapted models previously from the field of safety, and I think we've come up with something that I feel reasonably confident in, and it's going to be a useful framework for helping us think about these problems. So let me just talk you through it. Often organisations, to begin with, don't think much about risk management at all until there's a problem. Okay? It's often some scandal, some disaster, some really unexpected outcome that causes people to start thinking about risk seriously. So this reactive phase, or perhaps new regulations, as we saw with SPS220. When new regulations come along, often you see that reaction response. Then we've got this level 3 of maturity, which is a phase that is all about getting your systems right. Okay? And when I use the word systems, I'm using it in its broadest possible sense. Of course, IT systems are part of that, but it's much more than that. It's having the right policies, frameworks, staffing, the governance frameworks, and crucially, the remuneration policies. Okay? I would see all of those things as being part of the systems, getting all of that stuff, getting things sorted out so that we've got the correct structures in place. Then beyond that, we're getting into these higher levels of maturity, and to achieve these levels, you not only have to have the systems, but you also have much more of the cultural infrastructure in place. So now what's happening is that we're taking a much more proactive approach to risk management, and you could say that risk management starts to become embedded in our DNA. It's just how we do things without even thinking about it. Okay? I'm saying that to get to level 1, you would have to have all of these attributes. Okay? And as you cast your eye through that list, you'll see it's an incredibly demanding list. Okay? So I want to start by saying that I actually don't think there are any financial institutions in this country that are at level 1. Okay? I don't think any super funds are. I don't think any others are either. So I don't think super has to necessarily feel ashamed about that. This is just a really tough standard. Let's look at just a couple of them. This idea, commitment to continuous improvement. I would imagine a number of you here have read the recent report that APRA have put out about the Commonwealth Bank. Okay? One of the big themes in that report was that idea of chronic unease. Okay? And so, of course, the Commonwealth didn't have that. What they had was much more of this sense of complacency. To be at that level 1, you cannot afford to be complacent. You've got to have that sense, we can always do better. Okay? We've never arrived in a risk management sense. Having this idea of risk management as an enabler rather than a drag of performance. I suspect that's probably one of the very hardest to achieve. Yes? Look, if it's quick.
The healthcare.
Safety.
In safety and healthcare, is anyone in Australia modelling doing this sort of thing? So pharmaceutical companies, healthcare.
So yeah, so they're applying this way of thinking. I think there are some companies that have achieved pretty high levels of safety maturity. But remember, safety it's something that has been worked on for a long time now, decades. Yeah. Okay. So I don't think it should surprise us that financial institutions are still on a learning curve. And particularly in the case of superannuation, SPS220 only came in 5 years ago. The new risk management standards that have recently come out, ISO 31000 has recently been updated. And the big takeaway I got from that new standard was that this is hard. It's a multi-year iterative process. Okay? So I think it would be very surprising if any super fund was already at level 1. Okay, let's just talk through, let's come back and look at the systems level, this calculative level. So what I want to show you at this point are the results of some of our interviews. So I think it can be quite revealing just to look at some of the statements that came out of that interview process. Perhaps I have picked out a number of the more negative statements, so forgive me for that. I don't want to come across as overly negative in this presentation at all, but I think it's helpful if we can initially focus on where some of the challenges exist and where more work can be done. Okay. So as I went round talking to experts in this area, it was very obvious to me that in many cases they had been fairly recently implementing new IT systems. And previously, the existing systems that they'd had previously had not been very effective. So, and it's also important to understand that when you take on new IT infrastructure, there can be quite a long process in bedding it down. Moving on then to more of the people areas. Okay, so these quotes here referring to what extent do we have good people resources in risk. I've come away with the impression that there's still somewhat of a shortage of really good risk people, okay, throughout the industry. And again, that's not too surprising because risk management is a fairly young profession. There's probably not many people would have studied about risk management as part of their undergraduate studies, for example. And it's one of those things that to do well takes a lot of, it's not just quantitative skills, but you have to be a problem solver. You've got to have a lot of emotional intelligence. A number of people I interviewed highlighted that the soft skills that are important for being a really effective risk manager. So it doesn't surprise me that there's still somewhat of a shortage of really capable risk professionals, and that's a challenge for the whole industry to deal with. The next set of quotes is dealing more with the governance, the senior leaders, the directors and so forth. So yeah, if there's a shortage of risk professionals in the executive, it shouldn't surprise us that there's a shortage of good risk directors, okay? Because normally people become directors after a long executive career. So because this is such a young profession, it shouldn't surprise us that we just do not yet have a really good pipeline of people ready to take those director roles. So, the impression I got is that there's still a number of directors that while their heart's in the right place, they're certainly committed to risk management, they don't have a whole lot to contribute. Okay? They're not able to add a whole lot of value in terms of oversight of the risk management function. And this too is a big challenge that the superannuation industry is facing. think about the number of directors you need. Okay, so if there's 20 large super funds in Australia, that's before you get down into the middle levels and the smaller levels. So 20 large super funds, if each one needs about 10 directors, well, that's 200, okay? And we don't want too many people having multiple directorships because they just get overloaded. So that's a huge resourcing issue that I think we're currently struggling with. Now I want to move to looking at employee perceptions. Okay, so this is the first time I'm showing you some survey results. I'm showing, this is employee perceptions of the risk structures. Okay? So it's a set of survey items that we're asking on a six-point scale from strongly disagree to strongly agree. I'm showing here the results for the 4 funds that we have assessed so far. Okay. So starting at the bottom of this slide, you can see that this is where we've got the strongest ratings. So the staff ratings of risk training, risk knowledge, pretty good. You know, you really couldn't realistically expect much higher ratings than that. Once we start getting higher up, though, the results become a little more troubling and a little bit more of a spread across the 4 funds. Okay? So here we're looking at staff perceptions of line 2. Okay? How effective do staff find the line 2 teams? And then at the very top, now we've got staff perceptions of performance and remuneration systems. And I have to say this has probably been the biggest surprise for me coming out of this research so far. So we've got fairly low ratings here in this section. Let me give you an example of one of the survey items to kind of flesh this out a little bit more for you. So the item is, or one of the sample item is, remuneration systems encourage employees to focus on short-term rewards. Okay. So we have obviously a favourable response to that would be disagree, but we're finding significant numbers of people working in super funds who agree with that statement, and that really came as a surprise to me. To begin with, I hadn't appreciated the extent to which people are eligible for short-term incentives. Okay. So in the 4 funds that we've assessed so far, in every case there are a large number of staff that are eligible for short-term bonuses, and in a couple of cases all staff are eligible. Okay. Yeah, so that was a surprise to me. So this is an area that we will be investigating further. So in a field like superannuation, obviously you want staff to have a long-term focus. That's the nature of the business. And so if people are being focused through, if the remuneration systems are causing them to be very short-term focused, then I think that's something that deserves further scrutiny. And again, you see some variation across the funds. So it's not there are some common trends that we've seen, but I think it's fair to say that there is some variation. Even among large funds, there is a reasonable amount of variation in practices.
Just a quick observation. I read a lot about millennials.
About what, sorry?
Millennials.
Millennials, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
And so to me that's not surprising because a lot of the younger people, they're in a job not for the long term, they're in a job for short period of time, career progression, movement. So if you want to hire someone without a short-term incentives, a good person is not going to come on board. Mm-hmm. So that's the rationale behind all that.
So I think, well, that's an interesting point you've raised. I'm sure this area is something that people will want to discuss. So can I suggest we come back to it with the panel? It's such an interesting one. The commitment to continuous improvement. Again, this was an area that we saw some results, some interview comments highlighted some of the challenges, particularly the pressure to keep costs down. The pressure, that people are often so focused on the regulations and they don't really go above and beyond that. Okay? They just do the bare minimum to achieve what the regulators want. This issue of accountability, this is a crucial one. Remember, all of the funds in this sector have attempted to implement 3 lines of defence. Okay, so this idea that everybody has responsibility for risk management. It's clear that on the ground, people are still struggling with that. Risk management being viewed as an enabler, I would say this is the toughest attribute of all. It's very difficult to get past this perception that risk is a drag on performance. But it could come back to some of the problems that I mentioned earlier about the shortage of really high quality line 2 people. If you've got a lot of your line 2 people coming from a compliance background, maybe they're not able to be as effective as they could be as being problem solvers and trusted advisors, and therefore they just become like the police. We have introduced some new survey items that are designed to deal with these issues of risk management maturity. And here I'm presenting those for you item by item. So, lines of accountability, are they confusing or very clear? So in all of these cases, it's what we call a slider item. So there's 2 extreme ends and people have to choose a point somewhere on that spectrum. It's a 6-point scale. So the scores overall are not as high as you would like, and again, notice that there is some variation. In general, the pattern you see here is that Fund B is achieving weaker scores. Funds A, C and D generally are better. Okay. So this one here, fund risk management meets regulatory requirements and no more, or is it embraced as the best way to do business? So you'd like to see these scores higher. Is it mere compliance versus thoughtful engagement? You'd like to see that considerably higher. This one here, it's contrasting whether risk management is seen as a drag on performance or enabler for success. So here we've got 2 funds in the 60s. Okay. I should also mention, I'm presenting here the average scores across the organisation, but it's true to say that we did observe some variation within the organisations. What we've done is to do ratings at a business unit level, and we've allocated teams into different categories. So we've got some teams that we're calling admin teams, some that we're calling financial advice, some technology, what else? The risk teams and other. Where we've seen the lowest scores seems to be in the area of technology. Okay. So that in 3 of the 4 funds that we've assessed so far, we've noticed significantly lower scores in that technology area relative to the rest of the firm. So that's another thing that could be interesting to discuss on the panel. Right amount of the right risk, yep, and some more challenges identified there in the interviews. I want to sort of wrap things up at about 12:40 so there's plenty of time for the panel discussion. But let me just say, we wanted to spend some time looking at this issue of the reporting of risk events. We see this as a crucial indicator of risk management maturity. And that's for a number of reasons. You want people to feel very comfortable about speaking up. You want to be able to have a fairly complete record of all of the risk events so that the organisation can learn from them. Okay? Ultimately, the reason we report risk events is to try and fix things and make things better. So if people, for whatever reason, are not reporting, that's a lost opportunity. Okay? It fits in with that attribute that I mentioned earlier, having a commitment to continuous improvement. I would see reporting of risk events as being very much linked in with that attribute. So reporting of risk events is an interesting problem. We know from the safety literature that underreporting is a problem. Hard to measure though. Okay? If you ask people, do you always report risk events? They'll say, yeah. So we had to try and find a kind of a sneaky way of asking this. So we presented them with this item, which starts out, sometimes I skip reporting a risk event because. So we've got a whole list of possible justifications that people might use. And in a way, the way this item is set up, it gives people permission to admit that they sometimes skip. And so that helps us to get around the problem of social desirability bias that you often have in surveys. And not only that, but it helps us understand why people are not reporting. So that gives us the opportunity to learn from and perhaps make things a bit better. So let me just point out, work pressure is one of the most common reasons that people give for skipping. Yes, that's not too surprising. Okay. This one here about whether the event is not material, that's an interesting one because that could be fair enough. You don't want everyone, people reporting things like, I had a paper cut and had to put a Band-Aid on, So materiality is an issue. I guess the question is, do people really understand what's material or not, or are they just treating that as an excuse? Okay. I think this is a very interesting thing, particularly in the context of the Commonwealth Bank report that's just come out. Remember, one of the findings that APRA made in that case was that there was a lot of reporting going on, but nothing being done about it. And I guess if people have a sense that nothing's being done about the events that they raise, over time, I think what happens is they stop reporting. Yeah. So, of course, this is the answer you want. Okay, so for this particular item, we consider this to be the favourable response. Across the four funds, the lowest rate for this was 65%. So in other words, if you've got 65% giving this answer, that 35% essentially are admitting that they underreport. Okay. The best scores we've seen, in one of the funds we had 89% of staff giving this response, which of course means that 11%, the remainder, admit to some degree of underreporting. So I think this has been one of the most useful parts of the research. What kind of risk events? Yeah, that was one of our concerns because in different organisations, people might have different definitions of what kinds of events should be reported. So this item was designed to get at this question. So the respondents were asked, how likely is it that the following would be captured in your risk reporting system? So they give a rating from highly unlikely to highly likely, and that we used don't know here because depending on which team you're in, you might not have visibility on all of these. You might only have visibility on some. So some of these items would be more like more of a near miss scenario. So, for example, this one, a miscalculation where it's rectified before anything got processed. Okay, so that would be a classic near miss, and so we were expecting that perhaps that kind of thing would be less likely to be reported. So the last slide I want to present, I wanted to finish on a positive note because in doing this research, I don't want anyone to feel like I'm having a go at superannuation. To me, the purpose of this study was, to do an evaluation of risk management maturity, and I think that's appropriate 5 years after the introduction of SPS220. And as you would expect, things are not perfect. I think it is a positive, and I've tried to do this research in a constructive spirit to try and identify things that could be done better. But perhaps looking at the positives, these are our 4 dimensions of risk culture, and these are the same items that we used in the bank study 3 years ago. And so I thought you might find it interesting to see that in many cases the super funds are actually getting more favourable scores than the banks were doing 3 years ago. Now, of course, you could argue, well, maybe things have changed in the banks in the last 3 years. I can't say. I can see a few people shaking their heads. So every time you see a single asterisk, that's telling you that the scores are significantly better than the big 3 Australian banks. If you see 2 asterisks, that means that the scores are better than not only the Australian big banks, but the Canadian big banks, which are very good. Okay. So there's a lot of good news to report there, but notice that there is a similar pattern if you look across the 4 dimensions. The weakest one is still avoidance. Okay. So yes, avoidance I think is something that can be worked on more in the area of superannuation, and I think I want to make, there's a real danger with benchmarking that sometimes people can say, we're better than the banks, we can, that's fine, let's, but to me, that's not the way to approach this. Remember, I started out by saying one of the attributes of risk management maturity is that chronic unease, that concept of we have to always be improving, we have to do better. So I hope that you will leave with that viewpoint, okay, that this is an opportunity to do things better, not just to be satisfied that you outperform some other benchmark, but let's try and achieve excellence.